So good morning, everybody. Welcome here at the Cyprus Institute in Nicosia for our roundtable discussion on colors and colorful materials in New Kingdom Egypt. And rest assured, we are looking outside our bubble today and going beyond the Egyptian borders and beyond what Egyptologists normally do. The topic we are talking about today is relevant and much discussed, as shown by quite a lot of recent publications and projects, the authors and PIs of which are, fortunately, or most of them are here in the room. And I can name David Warburton's very recent book on colors in ancient Egypt, on Egyptian color terminology. We have Chianthi Thavapalan's, who wrote her book on colors in ancient Mesopotamia. We have Anna Hodgkins on here, who has a project on the production and craft interaction and craft production of colorful materials, and also Alexandra Rodler, who has an ERC grant on colorful materials more towards the classical antiquity. So also we are going beyond the borders of New Kingdom Egypt. Therefore, we brought together a group of people who are at the forefront of research on colors, colorful materials in Egypt and beyond. The people we are having here, and it's a great pleasure, we have Professor David Warburton. I already mentioned his very recent publication that just appeared in April, and I think everybody working on colors in ancient Egypt cannot go around his publications. We have Chianthi Thavapalan from Amsterdam, who is focusing on Mesopotamia and has written the book on that I also just mentioned on colors in ancient Mesopotamia. We have Andrew Shortland, and I think everybody who is working especially on Bronze Age glass knows him, and there is no way around him. As I also said, we have Alexandra Rodler with her research on colors more in classical antiquity, on pigments. So we're also very happy to have her here. Someone else, and here from the Cyprus Institute, is Thilo Rehren, who of course everybody will know, who is working on glass, but also metal, maybe most likely basically all around the world. So we have from the Università di Pisa, Gianluca Mignacci here, who is normally focusing more on how things are being produced on faience on Middle Kingdom Egypt. But also he, I think, will have a contribution to make to our meeting. We have Anna Hodgkins, whom I mentioned. She is working in Amana and is really on the ground, in the field, going out and excavating these colorful things, and now having this project where she looks into how these things were produced. We have Katja Broschat from the Leitza in Mainz. She's a conservator, but she also has experience in artisanal glassmaking, and probably no one since Howard Carter had more of these wonderful objects from the tomb of Tutankhamun in her hands than she. And so also she will definitely contribute to this morning. And then we have Professor John Baines from Oxford, also known, I guess, to everybody. He's one of those who already for a long time contributed to the study of art, but also to the study of ancient Egyptian color terminology. And I guess everybody will know his 1985, I think it was, article on the topic. My name is Henning Franzmeier. I'm currently here at the Cyprus Institute, and I'm excavating at Cantia. So like Anna Hodgkinson, I'm excavating the things we are going to talk about today. Before we start, I would like, of course, to express my sincere thanks to all the participants for coming the quite long way here to Cyprus, but also, of course, to the Cyprus Institute, who is hosting this meeting. Here we are today, and also to the Cypriot Research and Innovation Fund, which is co-funded by the EU within the framework of the Cohesion Policy Program Thalia 2021 to 2027. They provided the resources for this event. And of course, I would like all the colleagues here at the Cyprus Institute, namely Andri Kyriakou and Tanya Biberian, who took care of organizing this event and helping with all these little problems that can occur before one starts such a project. We will now, in this morning, have 4 short impulses by Shianthi Thavapalan, by Anna Hodgkinson, by Thilo Rehren, and myself. And afterwards, we will have discussions here amongst us, the 10 people that are here in the room. We will have a coffee break from 11:15 to 11:30, and if we have enough time towards the end of the second part, questions from the audience will be possible. So before starting, I would also like to remind you to make sure that your microphones are muted. I know there's quite a lot of you online, so please take care that this will be fine. Okay, so please allow me to also now start with the first impulse, colors in Egyptology. And I'm starting my impulse with kind of the classic approach, that is the classic approach in Egyptology over the last 60 years or so, since Wolfgang Schenkel's 1963 publication. So when people were talking about color in pharaonic Egypt, the classic approach was Egyptology is very much a philological field. It was the terminology of colors in ancient Egyptian language. How many color terms do we have? How can they be translated into modern terminology? And actually the discussion in Egyptology erupted a little bit before, one has to say, one of the few cases when Egyptology is probably kind of the trendsetter and ahead of the big stream. A few years before, Berlin and Kay brought forward their universalist ideas around basic color terms, basic color categories, which later in return had also been picked up in Egyptology. And when we have a look at these color schemes, this is basically what the focal areas are that Berlin and Kay introduced. So for colors, they did not just take one very specific color, but they have a range when it comes to hue and brightness in which a color is being defined. When we are now seeing all these kind of foci that appear in languages all around the world, in ancient Egypt, we don't have so many terms for all those. We have basically just 4 basic color terms, and I will not go too much into detail now. I know David Warburton will contribute a little bit more to this just after my little intervention. And in addition to those terms that we see here, black, white, red, and green, or probably grue, something between green and blue. Just think of the Watch Where, the great green blue of the sea, and probably the sea was not really green. So here we are already touching upon one of the issues here. We also have a couple of additional terms that refer mostly to materials like gold, which can be used for a kind of yellow. We have lapis lazuli for a dark blue, or turquoise for a light blue. So now when we are having a look actually at the materials, then we immediately see we have a little bit more colors. We have not just these basic color terms, but as was to be expected, also when we look just out in the nature, we have a lot more colors. And also when we are having a look into painting, I just took a random example of New Kingdom wall painting from a Theban tomb. You see that there is, for instance, a lot of brown, pink here, for which we do not have or cannot really grasp good color terms. So the questions that I would like to discuss is, when we are looking now at this, on the one hand, what about the translation of these ancient terms? If we have many more colors, of course, that the ancient Egyptians were using, how do we translate this? What is the difference between our modern Attic standpoint and the emic standpoint of ancient Egypt? And did really the ancient Egyptians do not have more color terms? And also we can think, this is something that is probably the second part of my question that we can discuss in the following 20-25 minutes. We see all these colored artificial materials popping up in New Kingdom Egypt. So we have suddenly glass. We see also many more colors in faience. We also see a change in wall paintings. And can we probably see somewhere whether this change, whether these additional materials are also represented somewhere in the language? Can we see a change in the language, in the color terms, in the way people talk about color? And this is the end of my impulse, and I would now invite you for the discussion. And of course, I know David Warburton has 2 slides, so probably I would now start with these 2 additional slides and invite David Warburton to talk about his slide and to enhance the perspective that I was opening up.
Okay. In principle, Schenkel identified 4 colors, and I stress that in contrast to other people, Schenkel insisted that the red was bright red and not red yellow, and he insists that the green is not green blue, but actually green. And so he had 4 colors that are established there. And based on that then, and my use with the materials, then I made another list here where you have black, white, red. And the problem is that there are at least 3 or 4 words for red in ancient Egyptian. In other words, there's not just the desher, but there's also the meresh and the chemes. And those meresh and chemes, they could be different forms of dull reds, or they could be bright reds. It's not at all clear. Then we have the one word then for green. And I take gold as meaning basically yellow, but in principle, in some cases, one could assume that they were identifying it with orange. And then they also had 2 blues, in other words, the light blue for the turquoise and dark blue for lapis lazuli. And then important is the Egyptian word for amethyst, hesmen, was used in Akkadian for purple, but it was not used in Egyptian for purple, as far as I can tell. So in other words, and what we have is a problem here. You were saying in our modern languages, and one should not forget, Worf talked about standard average European. And in standard average European, you have then the black and the white and the red, green, yellow, blue, and so forth. And in Russian, of course, there are 2 words for blue, and in Chinese, there are also 2 words for green. So in other words, in our own living modern world, there are other languages where they do divide the blue and the green spectrum. And of course, also in Hungarian, where they divide the red, but it's not as clear as in Russian and in Chinese with the green and the blue. I think that's the first slide. The second one then? Yeah, okay. And so I made it relatively clear that, strangely enough, the Egyptians will really have had what the real rainbow would look like if we could see a rainbow. And what I have never understood is, in a country where it almost never rains, how they came up to this idea.
Interventions, other answers to these kind of question. Also, when we are looking at changes in the language, I think, Shianti, you have seen that in Mesopotamia, you were talking about that in Mesopotamia, we can see these changes. And it's definitely something which in ancient Egyptian there was not so much attention towards this kind of topic. But could you probably talk a little bit about that in Mesopotamia, or what happens there?
Yeah, so I suppose my first question would be, where do we see in the Egyptian text these colors that we saw represented in the first slide, in the textual usage? Where do we see them as a kind of spectrum? Are there any texts that group these colors together that show us that this was their idea of the colors? that we do have in Mesopotamia, for example, in divination texts, in medical texts where they're describing the color changes of a person's skin or complexion, or the color of a wound or organs and so on. There we have these kind of color spectra where we have a range of words that are clearly referring to the physical, whatever is being described looked like. And here we can see that this group of words were somehow connected to each other. They had to do with appearance, and some of them are these classic color words, right? Like the reds and the black, but some of them are also words that we wouldn't necessarily consider color words because that doesn't conform to our idea of color. So one example of that would be this word darku, which means a kind of bruised color, it's a blackish, bluish color, but that was a part of their color vocabulary as well. So I would like to know from the Egyptian context where you see these words grouped together that show us that this was their idea of words that were semantically related and that they were semantically related to the concept of color.
Need to do research into this question, because this is something that we have identified as something that has not been done so much so far. David.
Sir, to Shanti's question is that I found these words by going through hundreds of different texts, and I stressed at the end of my book, where I was claiming there were all these terms, that in fact they were used very seldom and only in certain genres of texts. In the higher religious registers, you find these words used as color words, but you do not find them in normal texts. What you find in normal texts are basically only black and green and red and so forth. In other words, the colors that Schenkel saw. And so basically, Schenkel and I talk to each other on a relatively regular basis. And the fact is that he just says that what I say might conceivably be correct, but it doesn't correspond to the way the Egyptians thought.
It doesn't necessarily reflect the way Egyptians thought. And you mentioned that the more specific colors appear in a particular genre of text. Would that potentially indicate that different groups within the Egyptian society had a different vocabulary, a different understanding of these things? Or why do we see some colors everywhere in any text, but others only in specific ones?
Say, for one thing, we're talking about elite values. And then also the bureaucrats are the same ones who were responsible for the craftsmen in the House of Gold, where they worked with all of these precious materials. And those same bureaucrats will have been writing poetry and religious texts. And the correspondence there is very clear that these are elite values. And in the actual work of the craftsmen, they were dealing with the actual materials. In other words, the craftsmen in the palaces and in the temples were working with the actual materials. And then there were other people outside who were making faience. And then in between the faience and the precious materials, you have glass. So in other words, there are several different categories of craftsmen who are working with it. There are the poets and the bureaucrats, as I call them, and then there are the actual craftsmen who are dealing with actual colors and in several different ways. And I don't go into this because it's not part of my vocabulary, but obviously the craftsmen were very familiar with very different colors of wood. You have black wood and red wood and brown wood and so forth. And the other thing is that as far as I can tell, not only was the word hesman for amethyst never used as a color word, but also it would appear that ivory is not used as a color word either, although it's very frequently used as a material and very clearly for white. So in other words, there are a number of different categories of people that we're talking about and a number of categories of objects.
Hey, David, and also Thilo's question, it would be good for the Egyptian context to look specifically into these genres, because when I did that for Mesopotamia, what I found out was that, for instance, in the recipes that had to do with glassmaking, you had a different set of color terms that were relevant to the glassmakers. Now, whether or not the glassmakers, the actual craftsmen wrote these recipes, that question is debated, but the scribes, or like the people who wrote down the colors that had to do with glassmaking, were still working with a very specific vocabulary of color. And sometimes they are not referring to sort of the kind of the color value, but they're used in a technical way. They're technical terms, these colors, especially in the textile industry, in the leatherworking industries. So I think it's probably really important to look at how textual usage and cognitive categories map against each other in very, very specific contexts, because I don't think you're going to see one-to-one mapping there.
You a question or comment?
Me? Yes, I think one problem we have is the sort of general terms that we use. So people talk about scribes and craftspeople and so on. If this were to happen in the modern world, people would talk about these people as being patrons and artists. These are central activities of the society. Enormous resources are put into these activities. And for some reason, people in Egyptologists and other people who write about Egyptian art think that this was a sort of minor thing that was done by subordinate people. But I think the central decision makers in the society will be involved in all of this. And we should try to enlarge our understanding or our ideas about how what was done related to the leaders in the society, who were themselves not artists, we suppose, but people immediately below them will have been. And the craftspeople should probably be thought of as by another term than simply craft, talking about it as being artistic workshops or something like that, so that we can emphasize the very high value that all of this activity had, and of course the international connections that are involved in them. I think that's probably enough for now.
Us too. David.
I agree, of course, with this idea of patrons, and there's not just patrons, but there are also consumers. So in other words, and then we have a very grave problem when we start using the word aesthetic or artistic, because then we are starting a completely new category of discussion. So in other words, there are a number of things that are mixed up with this. But I do, in fact, completely agree with this. And this is where I stress that the elite values were what we see in the written text, of course, in the highest registers and so forth. And so that is decisive for the way I think. And I'm saying that some people actually thought this way, but I think that Schenkel is right that they were basically most people were basically living in a different world with just these couple of colors. And yet all of them were walking into the tombs where they could see all the colors. And all of them also knew people and so forth where they could see other colors. So in other words, there were a lot of different levels, not just the craftsmen, but the ordinary people when they see people like Akhenaten and so forth with all of their wealthy colors. So in other words, there are a lot of complications in that, and they are all social issues.
Respond to that in one way, which is that the number of people who went into tombs was probably rather small, and but the very highly colored environment in which people among the elite lived is very important, and of course has been important in many other societies too. And I would also question the extent to which we need to map language to what was being done. At the same time, people use terms for things like granite, which are not color terms, but they are terms for textures, and those will complement the color terminology and extend it. And so we have an Egyptian word sab, which means textured, and that is a kind of basic term in Egyptian. And we also have this possibility of extending through the colors of materials. And we must think about all the categories we lack, such as textile color, which again enrich ancient experience, but don't, I think, map easily to language.
I would like to build on something that you said about the emic perspective. That I think how much was a deliberate choice a color? I mean, if they really need to select a color, because if they don't need to select a color, sometimes they even don't need a term for this, so they need to build a term. I give an example of faience. I see that with faience, and I don't know, this is a question for Thilo and Katja probably, how much they can control the difference of color, because I see that in the whole range of faience objects, especially in the Middle Kingdom, they go from green to blue, light blue, dark blue. Do they really need to pinpoint a special color? Do they need this? And I build this on the suggestion of David that probably they also try to bring colors from materiality rather than having a choice of color. If you don't need to select a color, probably you don't even need a word from this color.
More comments on this topic? Okay, Andrew Shortland.
Go back a slide, please. Oh, maybe not. There we go. Yeah. Yeah, I'm obviously interested in the blues, in the Kesbej and in the Mefkat. You won't be surprised by that. And I'd like to ask David about that. So these are materials. So lapis and turquoise are stones. Yeah. But I wondered whether we have evidence that the words are used the same way we sort of use them in English. For example, turquoise. If I tell you I have a pair of turquoise trousers, no one suspects that I have stone trousers. Yeah. Similarly, if I say my wife has a turquoise necklace, you probably think she has a stone necklace. Do we have that sort of duality used in Egypt? In other words, are there definitely examples where we have the trousers in those terms?
The absolute best example of this is that if you read people's books, like my favorite is citing Wolf, who said that the Egyptians saw that trees were green. And in certain representations in the Book of the Dead, we have blue trees, and they're described in the Book of the Dead as being turquoise trees. And so that is very clear that they are referring to a color there and not to a stone. And that this is, I'm not claiming that thousands of people were thinking this way. I'm not saying that at all. I mean, even if the elite was agreed on these matters, it doesn't mean that everybody else in the rest of the country actually recognized those colors in that way. They might easily have been thinking of faience, for example.
I am happy with your explanation, but I wonder whether there's an element of and John was talking about, an element of quality to it as well. If we said someone was granite-faced, they wouldn't necessarily be red. They would be hard, or, I wonder whether there's something else with these materials rather than a color. The gods are lapis lazuli. They are blue. Are they blue, or do they have the quality of lapis lazuli? I don't know.
No, I mean, when they talk about lapis lazuli eyes, we have in Mesopotamia real eyes made of lapis lazuli, and we can easily see that were used for these purposes. And sometimes, of course, then the colors are abstract, but I don't think there's very much abstraction. I think there's a lot of materiality, and the Egyptians were, I don't think any of their vocabulary was really abstract as we understand it. They started it, and this is where my differences with Berlin and Kay are, that they assume that people start with abstraction. and then they develop a series of color terms based on abstraction, I assume these Egyptian colors are the origins of the system.
Definitely lapis lazuli trousers, amethyst trousers, calcite trousers, a whole bunch of trousers of different stones in Mesopotamia. And there were thousands of people using the words these ways. Not trousers, tunics, and all kinds of garments, also leather objects. So in Mesopotamia, the scribes, the lowest levels of scribes who were doing kind of the basic administrative work, they were very familiar with metonymic color terms. So, you know, color terms that are based on materials being used as to refer to things that are not made of those objects. But this we see especially in a time in exactly this period in the second millennium, where also the technology for dyeing these colors, the technology for making these colors in faience, in glass, and so on, that there is more interest in that. And I think this is significant, going back to the question of abstraction, because I think the more you see these colors as separate from the concrete identity of the turquoise, of the lapis lazuli, I think ideas about its quality, its nature as a color is also changing. And we see some of this reflected in the language, because at this point, some of the color words that are coming from objects, they are grammatically changing as well. They have new grammatical elements in them. And I think that's probably something significant, reflecting something significant, at least in Akkadian.
It was just saying, and one thing that I stress that it comes very clearly out of it, if you look at my list, that the Egyptians, in my opinion, started with materials. And already in third millennium Mesopotamia, we have the introduction of organic materials giving rise to color terms. And I think particularly of green yellow, where this is then vegetation, which is sometimes green, sometimes yellow with different meanings. And they put words together, and that green yellow does not equal the grue. And this is a very important thing, that the grue does not really exist, but it was invented by Berlin and Kay. But I think that this situation that the Mesopotamians were immediately thinking of dyes and of vegetation led to the fact that they came to a different level of abstraction.
Oh, John Baines.
These problems are not unique to the ancient Egyptians or to Mesopotamians, that color terminology maps very badly onto the world. And that is known today. All you have to do is look at a manufacturer's paint chart and see the colors. And so Berlin and Kay should be depended at least on one point, and that is that they do say that the basic color terms are very crude abstractions. They don't praise the color terms. The color terms are ways that people develop ways of talking about things, but they are not a very high level thing, I would say.
Light plays in Egyptian terminology, light. In the Greco-Roman world, we have light as part of defining the color, defining how it appears. And just because you mentioned the rainbow, so the light can be split in many ways. It doesn't require the water to split it. It can also be through grinding. Does it play a light role in terms of color?
My first reaction is immediately to say, yes, it does play a role. And second of all, I think in one of the next slides, I also have something on this matter.
I don't see anybody else, so I would like to ask Shianthi to come for the second impulse. So. Okay. Sorry. One second. Okay. Yeah, no, but it's not in full. Okay. 1 second, please. Just a little. It doesn't start again, the slideshow. Sorry, I need. Sorry. We are there, and now I need. Okay, so there we finally are. Welcome, Shianthi.
Great. Actually, the discussion we've been having so far is going to seamlessly flow into what I'm talking about. Oh,
sorry.
This is good. Can everyone see? Great. Because I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that we've already been talking about, which is about the relationship between materials and colors. And more specifically, my sort of impulse for you has to do with the relationship between crafting, that is to say, the making of color and color. So all of these things that we've been talking about, glass making, glazing, which we have in Mesopotamia, but dyeing, staining, ivories, for instance, and so on. So the importance of materiality for how people in the ancient Near East conceptualized and named colors has been a topic that many of us have written about and many of us have debated about. But I am still kind of struggling with understanding exactly what this means. How exactly do colorful objects speak, quote unquote, about their colors? I think this is an important question because it can help us understand broader concepts about agency, causality, relationality, all of which are central to material culture studies as a whole. So one way to think about it is that the physical properties of colored materials constrain or enable the use of certain color terms. So for example, let's take a stone, carnelian, and we can say that carnelian stands for the idea of red, and this idea can be represented in different languages in different ways using different words. Now, within cognitive linguistics, the relationship between materials, in this case the carnelian, and the idea of color, in this case red, can be explained as being based on perception, being based because of a prototypical example that was important for a particular society or culture. I'm thinking here of the research by Eleanor Roche in the 1970s. And it could be because of certain experiential associations. And this is an idea that has been emphasized by those who work on metaphor theory. Now, overall, this explanation is very attractive and very intuitive, but I think we can think about it based on sort of a couple of probing questions. First of all, if we think of materials as standing for, as being only symbols for ideas, then the agency that we attribute to materials is rather limited. When you say that the physical properties of matter, for example, the color of a stone has an effect on people, we concede that the material, the matter, and the person, the people who are interpreting ideas about them, are two separate entities. And the materials have some agency in this sort of model as symbols, but they are only given meaning through the cognition of people. So this model basically relies on the Cartesian divide of mind and matter that most literature in material science studies and science and technology studies has moved away from, right? So rather than looking at materials and people as separate entities with different levels of agency, new materialism, for example, encourages us to think about entities as being entangled, human beings, materials, various forces. We are all entangled, and the meanings and ideas surrounding the people, the materials, and the things, everything in between, are co-created through these entities. Now, that's a very abstract idea, and I want to see if we can sort of concretize that in an example from the ancient Near East, specifically Egypt in your case. But since I don't know much about Egypt, I'm going to talk about an example that I do know of, and that has to do with Mesopotamia. So the case study I want to start with is something that David has already mentioned, this material amethyst, which in Akkadian, at least in the 2nd millennium BC, the word for amethyst is hashmanu. Now, there was an older word based on Sumerian that was used in the first half of the 2nd millennium and the 3rd millennium. But this word was sort of replaced a little. I mean, the older word was still in use, but this word hashmanu became more in use starting from the mid-2nd millennium BCE. And it's probably related, as David mentioned, to the Egyptian word hesmen. And this is because they were getting a lot of amethyst materials, small materials made of amethyst from Egypt. So it makes sense. The loan idea of the loan word makes sense. But the question is, okay, we have amethyst and the word for amethyst, but what color was amethyst for these people, right? Now, what we mean by that is amethyst is for us a kind of a purple variety of quartz. It's kind of naturally occurring, right? But if we look at the cuneiform evidence, and I'm specifically for this, I'm going to go to the textile industry because I'm talking about crafting and material words being used as colors, right? And I'm going to go to the city of Ugarit in what is today Syria, and looking specifically how amethyst functions there as a word within the textile industry. So from Ugarit, first of all, you should know that there are texts that are written in Akkadian as well as Ugaritic. The texts that are written in Akkadian, in cuneiform, the texts that are written in Akkadian use logograms, and the texts that are written in Ugaritic are syllabic, okay? In the logographic cuneiform texts, amethyst, hashmanu, is categorized as zagin, which is lapis lazuli. So again, in the logographic text from Ugarit, amethyst is categorized as a type of lapis lazuli colored wool. In the same community from the same period, but in the syllabic text, amethyst is characterized as paimtu, which is a glowing charcoal, a glowing ember, so a reddish colored wool. So in the same community, we have three sort of material names, all referring to a color of wool that's the same thing. And in the cuneiform tradition from, so we're going to move forward about 1,000 years, so the mid-1st millennium BCE, we have a recipe for dyeing, specifically achieving amethyst-colored wool. And in that recipe, we are told that lapis lazuli-colored wool has to be over-dyed with a particular dye. And of course, like all wonderful cuneiform texts, this part is really broken off, so we don't know what the dye is. Anyway, the lapis lazuli-colored wool is dyed with this particular dye. We don't know what it is, and it results in this amethyst color. Now, because philologists think of amethyst as purple, and they think of lapis lazuli as blue, the explanation for this recipe has been, if you want to get purple colored wool, then you take blue colored wool and over-dyed with a red dye stuff, which results in amethyst colored wool. Again, seems like a straightforward explanation, but if we look at the reality of dyeing in this period. And some of this we've done as part of my work in Amsterdam, where we really dye with these substances. When you dye with woad, which is what we think the lapis colored wool was made of, you can really achieve a whole variety of colors, yellows to blues to greens, but also depending on how you use the leaves of the woad, how you process the vat, or even if you use the seeds of the woad plant versus the leaves and so on, you can also get pinks, like the color that I've shown here. So what I'm saying is our simplistic understanding of this dye recipe is based on a whole bunch of assumptions that philologists have made about the relationship between materials and color, which is kind of this one-to-one relationship. And what I want to kind of propose to you is that those who have identified Hashmanu as a kind of purple, including me, haven't really appreciated the sheer range of experiential associations through crafting that would have been available to the people of the Near East. And here, this example also shows us that it's not necessarily the case that the inherent properties of a material is going to transfer on to the textual usage or the cognitive categories that form in the minds of people, but rather it's this entanglement between the materials and the people in very specific contexts that is going to result in the meanings of these various colors. So this is my impulse for you to kind of discuss this question. Shall I go back? Yeah.
Yeah, please. Yeah. Thank you, Shianti. So I think David again has a little presentation. So we can immediately go on, and we see this kind of topic. Please allow me to change the camera so you are seen, the audience is being seen. But you can already start. I think.
Okay, so please show the slide. I mean, I don't need to be shown.
Yeah,
that's it. So in other words, the reason that I put this slide in is rather obvious, that the middle section at the top is actual fabric that was dyed, that was found at Katna. And when I tried to reproduce this color, then I had enormous problems. And it was only when I took an Egyptian scarab that I managed to get what I think is very close to being the right color. So I wouldn't insist that they didn't know what they were talking about. And my question really is that this loan word went from Egyptian to Akkadian, most assuredly, but it did not end up in Linear B. And so the question is, what did they use to describe this color that must have been used in the Mycenaean word in Mycenaean Greek? And this is a very serious question, because we have another level aside from the level of what are we looking at and so forth. We're looking about the exchange between the languages, because obviously in this case, it could be that our modern word purple was actually used in Mycenaean Greece in order to describe the color purple that they understood in the 2nd millennium BC. Or it could have been this other word relating to the Phoenicians.
Shianti.
Yeah, what I was trying to say in my example was, I don't think it referred to one color. That's what I was trying to say, because the reality of dyeing that it can achieve a range of colors, and depending on which colors they were interested in achieving with the dyeing material, whether it's murex or a vegetal dye, you could really achieve a range of colors. And I don't think this word refers to one particular color.
And
Okay.
so my reaction is to say, is this an accident?
Comments on this question, or Shianti?
Gianluca's take on this, since you're interested in crafting, about how you see the relationship between materials, people, what's happening in between, and how the materials and their affordances compel people to think in certain ways.
It's impulse that I think that sometimes I think that only when a color is needed in the society, so we need to relate to people that they need this color, is probably the moment that we also need a word. We need a word for this color. Otherwise, we stand in the middle of something that probably, and I agree with David on this, probably comes from the materiality rather than the color. I think they abstract when they need that special color. And this is the reason why we can't decide between blue and green and grue and all. It's the same for the word for amethyst and faience. They are both describing blue. Which type of blue they describe? One is bright blue, like the Chechenet, and the other one is the deep blue. Or maybe at the beginning they just describe the materiality, and then when the society need a color, they evolve into describing a color. So I mean, at the beginning, maybe that's quite complicated question, but I think at the beginning, maybe this really meant amethyst, and then at one point was absorbed in order to use for the colors.
Iranian, this particular color, purple, was extremely important, and modern scholars do not know what color it was. The question is this an accident that I reproduced it this way? Because I really did find that the Egyptian amethyst scarabs there were that color, and that color is what they reproduced in dye, at least in Katna, which is remarkable.
Scarabs here, we see already that there's a range of colors within the individual piece. Not being a craft person, certainly not a textile craft person, I was wondering how predictable were those craft practices in predicting the outcome of the color at the end. I think for faience, that blue-green is sometimes a bit hit and miss when they were firing things. How specific were they able to target a particular color, hue, strength, or were they just doing it depending on the raw material? It comes out like that or this?
I think. Okay, Scianthi.
Respond to that, I think this is where recipes come into play. And in Mesopotamia, we of course have recipes, as limited as they are. And sometimes the materials or the words that we think are materials, for instance, madder, or another example would be a very particular dye, which is called hashhuratu. And the huratu part of that means madder. The hashur part of that means apple. And I think this is a combination of apple bark and madder in a very particular ratio that is used as a dye to achieve a certain kind of orangey red. Okay, so I think craftspeople had recipes that allowed them, not 100% of course, but to control, at least within the textile industry, certain color effects. They also controlled the pH of the water, how much calcium there is. That's also reflected in the recipe. So they knew how to make a color cooler, how to make it warmer, how to achieve a whole range of what we would call purples, but they have different words for it, for instance, in this dyeing recipe. Or we call it red, all of them red, but for them, it's clearly different recipes. So not 100%, but they had different recipes, I think.
Or adjustment as you go along in the dyeing process?
Specific, like specific ratios, 1 part to 2 part or something. But the craftsperson, like the dyer or the glassmaker, that person's intuitive feelings is also very important because they're named in some of these recipes, like the recipes of so-and-so, just like the medical recipes, right? So the agency of the person, like the importance of the person to make these recipes, despite the ratios, is also very important. I think you're right.
She.
Just a slight adjustment to what Thilo said before about turquoise. In other words, when sometimes we're looking at a piece of faience and we think that they were intending turquoise, the problem is that there is this other word, chekinet. And chekinet, and this goes back to Alexandra's question and Gianluca's, chekinet actually probably means something like glänzend, brilliant, and not at all a color term in Egyptian. And so when they described faience as being chekinet, they might well have been stressing only the brilliance of the color and not the thing that we see as a hue if we use words like turquoise.
Raising this question because it was my exact point, because I wonder if they were really interested in color, or if they were interested, as you pointed out in your article, in something else, like the brightness or the texture is something very important. And I wonder for Shanti, if the recipe is given for is meant to give a specific color, or is just a recipe because to just give the effect. For instance, for the faience, I'm sure that they had a certain skill and knowledge, expertise, but I'm not sure if they had, and probably they have also the recipe, but I'm not sure if it was for obtaining a special color or if another feature of the object. It's quite important if we can discover in the text if they really was for a purpose of obtaining a color or obtaining something else.
Shanti probably has the more direct reply to.
Well, when I looked at the Akkadian color vocabulary, I thought they were talking about various profiles, right? So not just the chromatic hue, but also about various types of brightness, which is why I include a lot of words that refer to brightness, sometimes brightness and a hue, sometimes just brightness, sometimes a level of saturation, a tone, a word for tone, or patterns like dots or stripes. These are also, I think, as John already mentioned it in the previous, these are part of their color vocabulary for me. But I think David differs here.
In Egypt, we are definitely using the materials, and we are definitely talking about hues and colors and so forth. And one of the problems that I've noticed in your work is you actually use this European, which is really Eurocentric term, to say achromatic, because it's very clear that when the Egyptians painted black, they really meant black. They did not mean some kind of gray or brown or something like that. And when they dyed something white, they really meant white. So in other words, they were talking about chromatic things, not just with purple, but also with lapis lazuli being dark blue and these other things. So I think we should be very clear about the fact that there's one thing that the Egyptians are doing, and then this is changing in the Mesopotamian world because you have this tradition of the organic coloring materials, which are going to have very, very different influences. And this is where I think that they were aiming for this Egyptian amethyst purple. And this changed because in the Roman era and Byzantine era, purple is not this color.
And then it's already time for our break, but it's great that there is this discussion going on.
I have a question for Katja, especially. I wonder if the ancient Egyptian, do you think they were aware of color transformation after a while? For instance, we know that the blue tends to become black, very black, and for instance, even the faience tends to become green with the time, so it tends to fade. I wonder if you think that this was something that could be perceived in the short term, or this takes a lot of time in order to transformation of color.
If I answer, it's widely speculative, I have to say. I do believe that for some instances, for some pigments, you can see rather quick changes. Also for the yellow, orange, reddish pigments, changes from red to yellow due to UV light, for example, exposure. But it depends strongly on what you what object or what painting or what's depicted in what environment. So this would certainly need some experiments to really answer that question, if this can achieved in a so to say in a lifetime. So this can be acknowledged.
That's quite interesting, because it moves the focus on the performativity of putting a color rather than the exact color they were putting. This is quite interesting, this aspect.
Yeah, also, but Andrew.
Done some experiments with faience and trying to change color with, particularly with water. It's very vulnerable to changing color. So certainly I think within a lifetime or a couple of lifetimes, if you were using an object and using it with something that was liquid, you would see changes in color.
Because then there will be the
just
the
one
coffee
quick
break. Okay.
comment. I think with the glazed materials, the aging of the color, if you spoke about faience, is very different. But I think it's much faster if you look at the ones that are just mixed with some binding materials. And again, if it's outdoor, in the environment, in the sunlight strongly, that is a aging multiplicator anyway. Yeah, so there's a huge difference. So it's better to start with the easy peasy materials and not with the glazed, highly fired materials, I think.
Yeah, this is not a question, it's just a comment to what Andrew just said, which is very important, that in the Abusir papyri, we know that things were distinguished as being black and white and red, and we also know that these same things were lying around for centuries and not replaced. So in other words, the colors were changing, but they kept the terminology. We should not forget the world they lived in.
We have now reached our coffee break. We will now have a coffee break until 11:30. So also for all of you who are online, so now you can go grab a coffee or do whatever. And we are back in 12 minutes. Thank you very much.
From me as well, dear colleagues. My impulse question, or it has two parts actually, which I'm going to try to convey clearly if I can. So in general, I'm looking at colorful materials, but from the archaeological and material culture perspective. So we have a range of so-called related, as in high temperature materials, which seem to imitate the desired materials, such as, for instance, purple glass, which imitates, or which we think possibly might imitate amethyst, or blue glass that it might imitate lapis lazuli. But can we actually speak of imitation in its sense here? Do we actually have sufficient evidence? I know we've already spoken about this to a certain extent. So, but do we have enough evidence to actually say that this was the case? We can, for instance, think about the death mask of Tutankhamun, which combines the two materials, lapis lazuli and blue glass. So actually two materials combined in one object. And also Andrew Shortland, who's here with us today, has juxtaposed the the term lapis lazuli from the mountain as opposed to lapis that flows and similar references. So can we actually deduce a conceptual equivalence from these two references, or is there a difference in value and perception between these natural and artificial stones? So can we actually also consider if, for instance, lapis lazuli is prime value material as opposed to glass or faience being cheaper imitations or substitutes? And here we can also, to a certain extent, reflect what we have already discussed in the previous impulse questions regarding the ranges of colors or individual colors. So, for instance, the ranges of blues that are produced by the craftspeople, how much experimentation actually plays a role in all of this. And oops, there we go. So my second part would be the fact that the workshops at Amana specifically frequently produced overlapping evidence with with regard to hot and cold working, actually. So we're actually looking at glass and faience, which were dependent on high temperatures, while semi-precious stones such as agate and carnelian were chipped and processed using cold working technologies. However, we also encounter glass that has been chipped, so processed glass bars, but that were processed into finished objects such as inlays and amulets, such as you can see here. So if we think about the choice and agency of the craftspeople, do we actually believe that this was pure practicality? What reasons stand behind this, this approach? Or yes, is there another reason to believe that this was the prescribed production method? Thank you very much. Can I sit down a bit?
Thank you, Anna. And once more, now we have the intervention from David Warburton first, and then Gianluca Mignacci.
Yeah, so my first remark is, of course, that we should distinguish between color and preciosity, which are real values, and then practicality is not values. And what the craftsmen actually thought they were doing with these materials in the two images that we see here, they're imitating something else, but it's quite obviously not a successful imitation. It is simply something that has some color and so forth. And the next one then, please. Yeah, and this originally started as a sort of joke that I was playing, and then I realized there was a system to it. That, in other words, we have an awful lot of materials here that are worked. And this, I think one should stress that it's the outcome of the process of working, and it's not necessarily the actual original things alone without the craftsmanship that have an effect. And in fact, all of these are original materials. Even the light blue scarab in the middle of the bottom row is actual turquoise and not faience or something like that. So in other words, we have here a set of original materials, including ivory and gold, carnelian, lapis lazuli, Upper Egyptian greenstone, probably even there's something that might be rock crystal, and then there are some things that are types of limestone. And so this is the range of colors that you get in the materials, and not all of these are then addressed as color terms. So the next one, please. So important for me is that when they're making glass, one thing I stress here is that if you look at this, most of the stuff that is yellow there is really yellow, and in only one or two cases do we get a little bit of orange. So in other words, these colors that you see here reproduced in the glass are the actual things that I associate with colors in language based on natural materials. So I just beg you, all of you, to remember that one should not necessarily think simply of ordinary stones lying around, or even of expensive lapis lazuli as a stone, but as a worked material. It has a very different appearance, and those appearances are then what is mimicked in the glass.
Gianluca Mignacci.
To answer to Anna, to give another impulse to the discussion about the imitation, because usually we say that faience is a sort of imitation, a cheaper imitation of lapis lazuli, but I wonder how much secret was, for instance, faience. We know a huge production of faience. We have 3 titles for the faience producer. It's not in the satire of Katie, is not in Destruction of Katie, is not mentioned any work about faience. So it's really something that probably we should revise a little bit, this idea of imitation, because I suspect that there is 2 different values, and probably faience could be even more valuable for their shining effect, the glance effect, than turquoise. For instance, there is an article that is going to appear this year in the Evo journal in the Egitto e Vicino Oriente of University of Pisa. That is about the production in the pre-dynastic made by Lobna Youssef, one of my students, about the fact that there are some pottery vessels that in pre-dynastic, they imitate the stone vessels. They always say this is a sort of cheaper imitation of the more precious material. But she noticed also how the pottery vessels, they influenced the stone vessel production. So it was a cross-crafting intersection. So I wonder just to rethink a little bit about the imitation and exactly what is the value given to the materiality of things. For instance, sometimes a coffin needs to be of full gold, or is enough just a little golden foil to make it shining, to make it yellow or like the sun?
There is a comment by David Warburton, and then I would like to have a comment myself.
Really be very conscious about the fact that faience was probably much cheaper than the glass. And glass was a particular technology, and the production of glass was restricted to very few places in comparison to faience. And then the original materials were, of course, even more expensive. So we have a hierarchy of material values in terms of prices there, and not just imitations of things. And we also don't even know what they were aiming at. That I stress in the case of a lot of faience, I think the word chekinet simply means glänzend, brilliant. In other words, it has a very different meaning than if we think that we see blue or green there. They didn't necessarily see those as those colors in faience. With lapis lazuli, they definitely saw color.
Value that we give to lapis lazuli doesn't mean that the Egyptians, they want to achieve exactly the same things with faience and lapis lazuli. It's not one substituting the other.
There's another term that is being used by Sherratt and Sherratt, import substitute. This, of course, goes in the direction of value. But what I would like to point out is, especially when we are looking at some of these polychrome glass objects, but also when we think of faience, of the really big faience things, objects as large as that you will not have from the natural material. I think 1.5 meters high lapis object, a turquoise object, I don't know if there is any so big kind of lapis existing somewhere in the world. So there is a little bit more to that. And all these, this variety of colors in these polychrome objects, that's also something that with natural objects, with natural materials, we would hardly get, for sure. There's now a question by Andrew Shortland and then David Warburton again.
I will come back to the value idea. So I think very early on in glass making in range 2000 or so, I think that the value of glass and lapis is about the same. I don't think they're distinguishing. I can support that later with an argument, but nevertheless. And therefore, I'm not that keen on the word imitation, which suggests inferiority. And I prefer the word evocation, which has other connections. It might not be so good, but something for us to knock around. But I think very quickly the value of glass, perhaps because it becomes more and more common, starts to tail. And even by our manner, we have Petrie finding hundreds of glass fragments in the dumps at Armana. He doesn't find hundreds of pieces of lapis there. Now that's telling us something about value in my book. So I think we've got a change as we go through. As faience, just to be provocative, a very senior Oxford professor, I was studying faience, I won't name him, used to regard faience as ancient Egyptian plastic. I can see from your face, my face was exactly the same, but it is a point of view. It's quite ubiquitous on sites. But, you know, we can have that argument afterwards. Anyway, back to you.
Admit that I consider myself to be a dead white male, but I also think that, in fact, faience is plastic. That is definitely my opinion. I just want to say a very important point when one talks about what the Sharat said, import substitution. Anna stressed we have then lapis lazuli and glass in the Mask of Tutankhamun and coffin because they did things with glass they could not do with lapis lazuli. And that meant it is not import substitution. This is innovation, and it is then a way of reproducing something, but they are dealing with the idea of lapis lazuli in the end. But it is glass that is being used for something where they could have done it with lapis lazuli, but it would have been easier with glass, and they did it in a case where they were not saving any money at all.
This short intervention, but when I think of what you, Katja, and Thilo, what you found out on the Mask of Tutankhamun, these blue stripes of glass that are 50 centimeters long, it's something that with lapis, at least with one stone, you for sure wouldn't be able to do. So this underlines exactly this kind of argument. But Anna.
That the mask is rather boring in that respect because it combines two materials basically, but we have other objects from the tomb that combine even more blue, in this case, blue materials. And what we can tell for this finds or for this assemblage of finds, we don't see any reception of an imitating material. We don't see that glass is less valuable. On the contrary, our feelings are that glass was even more highly valued just by looking at it and trying to find patterns among hundreds of finds. And someone else wrote, I can't remember right now, that the magic of the man-made material that added up, also the pyrotechnical process, that it might have even added up to the way people looked at this material. And we can, at least we don't see any pattern that puts these materials on different valued levels. We can't see that yet, not at all. Yeah.
Of making and what is all connected to this. I mean, now I would like to pass to Anna, but it's probably something we should discuss at a later point.
Actually, I just wanted to say that too, because the magic of making, we don't really have glass or faience production mentioned anywhere, possibility being a possible, well, a tomb scene from the 26th dynasty, but that's basically all we have. So it is a secret, it is a magic process. And what I was going to say, and this is also highlighting what Gianluca just said just now, is the affordance of the material, right? So actually big objects, small intricate objects, also the glass strips in the Mask of Tutankhamun, that is something that, yeah, we just said we can't really achieve, or only very difficultly achieve, using stones, using natural ingredients. And so, of course, this is also something that we need to consider in this aspect. And this is also something that when we were talking about the glass recipes, etc., in the previous session, experimentation and the availability of natural ingredients, such as, for instance, the cobalt ore, or for instance, bronze scrap that was used as colorants in glass and faience. was it actually available? How was it then processed? We know that it had to be processed and then included in the mixture, but then a lot of experimentation must have taken place, probably also in secret, in order to achieve the desired hues of the faience, whether regarded as plastic or not, or the glass actually. And with regard to the faience, I mean, again, affordability of the material, because actually for faience we simply don't need as high a temperature as for glass. So exactly. It is more available throughout society, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a more difficult or less a less valuable material at all, in my opinion. So
we didn't find almost any working place for faience. So basically, even if it was so widespread, I expected to find hundreds of kilns for faience, and we didn't find. I don't know if in Amarna you have some news. And I want to build on something that Chianti said about the agency, because instead of looking at the colors, sometimes we should look at the agency of the material, because probably what they want to achieve with the faience or with glass is the shyness rather than the blue. So it's pointless to put lapis lazuli is not shining as much as faience or glass. So I think sometimes we should also go back to the agency of the material rather than starting from the ethic perspective, which colors they want to combine together.
Very important is that they may not actually have needed kilns in order to make faience. It's entirely possible they could have been making it in very strong fires, and there wouldn't be any traces whatsoever of the activity, which I assume that's of some importance. And as long as I'm speaking, I just stress what I hope that everyone can see from this slide in front of us here, that these colors are then the colors of the materials that I've mentioned for the most part that are being reproduced in glass. And it's not just that they're shining, it is that they are reproducing colors there in one way or another. And it's very clear that they're making some different nuances. And what's very, very interesting is that green is not at all important in Egypt. It's a very, very interesting piece. And I just stress that scarab at the bottom is then a scarab that is made of glass or faience, and it is not one of the natural ones. All of the items in the preceding slide were all of the natural materials and so forth, but they also could produce in faience or glass an exact replication of what they were making with the real materials.
Line what you said about the glass being very particular in evocating existing precious stones. If you look at China, as I know you are doing, and look at glass in China, it imitates jade. It has this opacity, this translucency, very much the pastel colors rather than the strong primary colors we see here in Egypt, Mesopotamia. I think that's a very striking example how much the glass makers were making an effort to reproduce what they really felt was the most valuable material.
The patrons who were deciding what colors were being chosen.
I was wanting actually to say something quite different, which is that we should try to remember that faience in particular is used for an extraordinary variety of purposes and at different scales. So we have a statue of faience that was more than 2 meters high. And we also have these fabulously beautiful objects, this Sphinx, which is this kind of size in the Met. And so these ones would have exceeded in value what could be done in many other materials, but it would have taken the very highest possible technology, and that should not be compared with a mass-produced Shabti. I mean, it's a very obvious point, but there will be different levels in all of this.
Other comment or intervention now? You, okay.
For Katia or Thilo, how difficult was to obtain the green? Because as David pointed out, in faience, you see shade of greens, but I think that they never aim to produce the green. Sometimes I have the feeling, for my experience, I only worked with 1,600 faience figurines, but it looks like it was casualty. It was not real attempt to obtain green. They mainly aim for the blue, bright blue, deep blue. Sometimes went on the light blue. It's okay, but the green was really, I don't know how many figurines, but I have like those and not so many on such a large corpus.
A year and a half as a doctoral student trying to make faience, and discovered the many, many ways you can go wrong in doing that. I think it is a really interesting subject about how much control they might have had and what colors they were aiming at and whether the color they got was what they wanted. All of these sorts of questions are really interesting. And I take what David was saying about being able to make faience fairly freely, but actually, if you want the color you want, you have to control the conditions really, really carefully. And I think it's an area of research that's been underlooked at. The other possibility, of course, is whether the objects we look at, especially the faience, have changed color over time. Very, very readily changed color. And so they're not even necessarily reflecting the colors that they were when they were made.
Native. I mean, we don't really know what they were able to do and how, if it was a matter, let's put it this way. We don't know if it was a problem to produce certain greens, and this is why they didn't do it so much. We have it in glass particularly, or if there was not really a need for green. And again, widely speculative, a lot of people see turquoise as a green. So if this was also matching some ancient people's reception, there was not a strong need of another green in the artificial material production. But again, this is just first thoughts on this, and we have to follow this question.
Must say, I think that someplace in the course of my work, I really drew the conclusion the Egyptians were not particularly interested in green. And I stress that I think that this scarab that I show at the bottom of the second column there, that is an artificial material, I think it is a real heart scarab. In other words, that they were intending to make the color green, and that was an indication that they could actually aim at that color and that they made it. In other words, the real heart scarabs are almost all of green. So there were particular uses where green was of some value, but it was not a color that the Egyptians really particularly appreciated, in contrast to China.
Also, we are excavating this palace in Cantir, and we have wall paintings and no green so far, even though the preservation of the colors seems to be quite good. But Andrew, you had... Okay, Gianluca.
Green for paintings was used. I mean, they valued because the color of Osiris was green. So actually, in the painting they used. I don't know why they didn't use so much in glass and faience. This was quite low scale.
So
Yanthi, and then I think Anna.
So I just note, we do have very clear examples of deliberate use of green in the Amarna tiles, where they have a beautiful foliage, and that is a lead antimonate copper yellow green. So not a blue, is it turquoise, is it green? This is a deliberate use of green. So when they wanted it, they could produce it.
Yeah, I just also wanted to add from the Mesopotamian perspective that green was very important in painting, but also in the textile industry. Reds and blues and purples were more important, but green was certainly there. And green was for a long time, people thought that, we have glaze from Mesopotamia, right? These glazed, the green was a very important glazing color because all of the glazed material from the site of Nuzi looked green. But now it seems that they may have been blue, but they have degraded to green. So that question still has to be answered because what looks green now may have been originally a different color. But at least when it comes to pigments, ivories, dyeing, all of other areas where colors are being produced, green was important in Mesopotamia.
Needed questions? It would be is there someone else, Anna?
What Andre just said with regard to glass in green, there's hardly any at Amarna. We have some, but we have very little, and we don't even know if it's actually really even Egyptian. It's still one of those questions. But definitely the green tiles, as you said, and also if we think about the North Palace, for instance, the green room, which is painted with foliage, natural environment, obviously reflecting exactly what they saw on the banks of the Nile, etc. That is definitely the case. But that's just what I wanted to say. So thank you all for your input.
Okay. The time to announce Tilo Rehren as speaker.
What we heard so far in terms of materials, materiality, and we have seen a range of different things and discussed, is it the stone, is it the glass, which are, I think, very much our categories and things that we have spent decades as scientists to study, not just for colored materials, it's for basically everything that we can get our sticky fingers on. And we have invested heavily in equipment, mass spectrometer, or the more convenient now handheld XRF things, and we produce these fantastic graphs which describe on the basis of trace elements how we see the world, how we see these materials from our perspective and with our research questions firmly in mind. A lot of that research comes out of a tradition of earth science, material science research, where we have our pre-hardwired set of questions, what we want to do, beginning from the right label in a catalog to, yes, the trace element or the lead isotope provenancing question, where does the raw material actually came from? And we have made a massive advance with that in our, I'm not sure understanding, but in our structuring of past materials. But I want to stress that, in my view, that is very much based on our interests, our current understanding how to deal with these things. And the discussion we had this morning so far, I think, pushed us to realize a bit more how important it is to focus on the view of the people 3,000 years ago, 3,500 years, if we ever want to understand how they were interacting, how they were thinking, how they were behaving, without a periodic table of elements, without, as I said, mass spectrometry and all of that. These things don't matter to them. What I've struggled to see is what actually did matter to them beyond what we learn from the texts. Now, the texts are highly informative. I have no question about that. But I believe there is a world beyond the texts as well. And that is what I would be very interested to understand better: parameters, aspects of materials, the sound, the smell, the taste, the weight, those more experiential aspects of past materials, the brilliance, and how can we approach these qualities now with our ongoing research in order to try hard, but maybe fail, but to try and see the world a bit more with the eyes of the people who actually created that world, both as craftspeople shoving wood in a furnace and being dirty from head to toe, and as the delicate artists who were making for the patrons the fantastic objects that we admire today, and how they interacted with those patrons. We understood there are different terminology sets probably valid for different layers of society. So how do we approach the reality of the past without being totally absorbed by our own reality today and our narrow-mindedness? In addition to that, we have seen something that is intriguing me also for some time now, the interaction between different technologies, the interaction between different materials, and the choices that people took. If you look at the pyramid on the right, you will see there's one top final product, but you could have reached that starting from a number of different starting points along the line of always lead to Rome. If you study Rome, you don't know. If you study that final product, you don't necessarily know what was the starting material, which choices of the different ways to get there were taken. And while we still very much cherish that chain operatoire approach, which is a chain, a linear sequence of actions, I think we have here a fantastic opportunity to look into the interaction between different technologies, certainly within the high temperature range, and see at which waypoints the craftspeople, the artisans, the artists did take a decision. Where did they have a choice? And if they had a choice, what were the limitations in those choices? Of course, there were the material limitations. They couldn't take substances they couldn't access geographically. There were limitations by the physics of law and chemistry, but there are also, I would assume, limitations in their head. The same way that I made a choice this morning to dress and not to come here in my sleeping gown, because it's just inappropriate. It would have been perfectly practical. It would have saved me a few minutes of my time, but I just decided not to do it. While a Roman would happily come in their toga, not looking too different maybe to my nightwear. So that sort of understanding what drives people taking their choices, taking their decisions, is something that these high temperature, heavily interconnected materials, I think, offer us a fantastic opportunity to explore, to push archaeometry beyond being a material science into actually archaeological science, focusing on the people of the past and using the inherited material just as a proxy and a pathway to them. Thank you.
We have once more a little intervention with, I think, 2 slides by David Warburton.
Of course, I must say that when I saw these impulse questions, I was absolutely delighted that you had realized that the important thing is not technology. In other words, it's the people who are behind this, who are deciding what's happening. It's not technology. And that leads then to the attitude that I have is that I fear that your web approach might just lead to an extraordinary amount of speculation. And this is, yeah, no, but this is where I intensely disagree. I mean, I have lived through Polotsky, Polanyi, and Berlin and Kay, and I know how much idiotic, stupid speculation there can be, and you can avoid all of that if you just ask the right questions. And so I am definitely opposed to the idea that all thought is speculation once you leave the natural science approach. And the point is, the natural science approach is very useful, but it's not just speculation. In other words, we have to really use analytical methods and to discuss how do we pose a question that we can actually answer, and what kind of answers are we looking for? I think these are the important points. And so I go through all of that and I say that in the end, what I found with my methods of saying that they are using these words for glass and for the stones in terms of hue, and that's the last part, insofar as A, human thoughts must be expressed in language, at least when you are communicating. In other words, it's possible that you can think without language, but if you're communicating, you have to use language to express your thoughts. And that color means hue for most people. And I think we frequently forget that in our business, that this is what people are actually buying when they go into a fashion store or whatever. They're looking at the hues and the shades and so forth. They're not looking at the texture necessarily. And that's where I say that in using this terminology to describe colors, using the actual materials is where the Egyptians started, and then the abstraction came after this. And it began in Mesopotamia and continued in Greece. And this was not anything that I want to discuss today, but as long as China has been mentioned, there is a very important break in the first millennium BC where the Greeks chose a number of words, and half of their words were loan words that they did not know what they actually meant. And at this same time, the Chinese had abstract words for colors in the first millennium BC. And so they took the route that we have reached today using the abstract terms, but the Greeks have abandoned their colors so that actually the word kuanios is now being replaced by blue. In other words, there is a real change there in the way people are going on. So the next one then, please. Oh yeah, and then here is one, just a quote from somebody who actually was not speculating and who was trying to say what they were doing when they were making imitations of materials. And then this person says that the craftsmen were using their material environment. Their analysis from a cognitive and semiotic point of view offers a great potential and should interest anybody who intends to grasp the mental universe of the workers of matter. And my comment on that is what you see at the bottom. And when we're talking about these illusionary imitations, it is amazing that she thinks about the craftsmen and not about the consumers. And where John used the word patrons before, consumers is also the point. And this is where the elite is very important. And I know that I have spent decades trying to say, yes, we are talking about elite values when we work in Egyptology, but those elite, they decide what we think, because we don't really have access to the craftsmen. And so we have to consider to what extent those elite values have to be accepted as being the values that they passed on to society.
Are there immediate responses? Gianluca Mignacci.
For all these inputs are too many for this, but I would like to point something that Thilo said, then maybe we can go back to what David said. But I like the idea of moving the taxonomy and start to see the process, the performance of things, because I think this is quite important. And I would like to quote one example we did in Pisa with the project, because we start to analyze the clay figurines and we remove the taxonomy, the modern taxonomy, type 1, type 2, type 3, and we start to analyze them by the performance, how they were made. made using the chain operatoire and dividing into different steps of production. And this actually gave something new, surprising association between the object. And thanks to this, we also discovered probably some tools used by the healers, which is an article that is going to appear. So I really like the approach of Thilo, that we should remove a little bit the differentiation, because we see only at the finished product, while there is the whole chain operatoire that we need to dissect as much as we can. It's normal that we can't see everything. And then once we have dissected, we can try to recombine the possible pathway that I really like as a strategy to see where this could have led the ancient Egyptian into the production.
Make a comment on that. This is, of course, also where innovation comes into play. Because if you have a lot of different ways of arriving somewhere, you might also go wrong, which sometimes means really going wrong, but sometimes might also mean discovering something new, which then, of course, leads to also the question, if someone discovers something new, how is this being put into, how is this received by the consumers, the patrons, or whatever we want to call them? How will an innovation then really persist if it's something that we would call an innovation?
This is the hopeful monsters of Andrew, probably.
I was talking about innovation, and when we have this possible web of possible pathways where you can make a lot of decisions, have a lot of different ways, you might go wrong, which sometimes means really you go wrong, but it sometimes might lead to innovation.
You're going
and
to
do something new. And then the question is, how is this, how is a kind of discovery that is being made by a craftsperson, how is this being received by a patron, a consumer?
Yeah.
So Andrew Schott.
Yeah, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. And I think I'm studying porcelain a lot at the moment, and there are vast piles of porcelain wasters alongside every porcelain factory in the world if they haven't been shoveled away. There were a lot of things that went wrong in production. But I think occasionally something that went wrong was used locally, maybe. Oh, well, maybe you can use this to make a bangle, a necklace or whatever. But I think that last line there on the slide, I mean, there's also that idea about consumers. Someone somewhere spots there is, to use a very modern term, which everyone will hate, a market for this thing, that they can repeat it and use it for something. And I think that's when you start to get an invention and an innovation. And I think that's perhaps one of the things behind glass and maybe behind faience as well. So the idea that, yeah, lots of mistakes, but occasionally someone recognizes you could use it for something.
David, I think you had another comment, and then Shianthi. Okay, Shianthi.
Thinking about how we can, of course, there's going to be some speculation, and I'm trying to think about what exactly we mean by emic view, right? I don't think we mean getting into the head of a metal worker or a glass maker. That's not, I think, what you mean. What you mean is to understand the shared behaviors and values and the processes that take place within certain making environments. And this doesn't have to be speculative. For instance, the historian of science, Pamela Smith, who's written extensively about recipes from early modern Europe, has done exactly this. And she uses the concept of the imaginary. She calls it a material imaginary. And she tries to reconstruct the material imaginary, the shared concepts about that craftspeople had, whether it was ink makers or textile dyers or whatever, their ideas about what materials are, how they transform, their relationship to the environment and nature. And these behaviors and values you can have access to from her in her analysis. Now you can criticize that work and say, well, it lacks analytical precision, but I think this is where the non-textual view, a view that is based on archaeological material and this kind of analytic precision can be given to this, I think. So I think there is potential to understand not what the glassmaker was thinking, but rather the shared sort of imaginary behind the glass working workshops here in Egypt or Mesopotamia, and how those things shaped what they thought about materials, which is definitely different from scholarly perspectives, elite perspectives. And this, in the Mesopotamian textual record, we see very different ideas about what materials are, even in different kinds of genres of text. So there was no one way of thinking about what a stone is or what a plant is, right?
Okay, I have two completely different points, but to take up this point that was just mentioned here, I'll start with that one. I think you have to be very conscious of the fact that there has been a lot of discussion about the way that the craftsmen are making these colors. But I think if you really want to face the fact that we have to understand something about getting into their heads, then the one thing you really have to do is look at how they use the colors in painting. Because this is extremely important for understanding what people who were thinking were doing. That is not speculation about the craftsmen and so forth. It's a fact that they use colors in a way that does not correspond to our understanding of the way that we think colors should be used. In other words, naturalism and so forth. And it's very important to realize that. So that's the one point that I wanted to make. And the other completely different point about that is that I wanted to say that about 20 years ago or something like that, in Topoi, we put together a book on innovation by the people who were doing science. And so almost all of the chapters in that book are talking about how wonderful you can glorify innovation and invention and creation and so forth. And normally people throw out my chapters when I say something divergent, but they actually published my article there, which was Why Innovate? And the point was that innovation has become normal since 1760. But before 1760, innovation was not really particularly important. And so we should get out of our own mindset of thinking this way. And I noticed that my colleagues refused to do that, but they at least published my paper.
Once more, a pretty provocative idea. But on the other hand, still, it raises the question, why do we some point, I mean, over the New Kingdom, we have certainly, or generally in ancient Egypt, we have continuity and faience making that roughly stayed the same. I mean, of course, there are small differences, but for 3,000 years, they were producing this kind of material. While on the other hand, in the New Kingdom, then suddenly we have in faience totally different colors, and we have glass. So how does this happen? Why does this happen at these moments? And why, when it comes to glass, suddenly this kind of innovation gets lost?
Is what they were doing with it.
To what you said occurs to me, which is that, well, I have two examples. They're totally unrelated, but there's this famous book called The Camel and the Wheel, which points out that wheels were around and widely used in ancient societies, but in the Middle East in particular, the wheel more or less disappeared. And then you have the case of ceramics. This is now in the Pacific, where ceramics spread across the Pacific. Don't ask me for the precise date, but around the turn of the era, and then they disappeared again. And so we shouldn't think of these as one-way developments. And I think the same applies to glass in Egypt, that glass is something which is a restricted product in the New Kingdom. It's never a mass object which will be diffused through society, and it was not actually necessary. And you have to go then to another 800 years or something before there is significant redevelopment of glass. And so a very long-term, very broad perspective can help in thinking about some of these questions.
But actually, with regard to glass, I think we have to just see the nuances within society. So actually, I'm talking about Amana because, well, I work there. We have actually got a lot of so-called low status glass products actually just spread throughout the low status houses as well. So we actually have a lot of glass beads together with faience, of course. And then the more elaborate glass vessels, which obviously would have taken a lot more skill to produce in, well, higher status housing, but also in the so-called palace. Well, they're not palace waste heaps, but they're in the central city. So we do actually have a lot of glass that was accessible to society, and we do have a lot of the workshops in private housing. So actually it is more widespread, at least at that part of the New Kingdom in any case. And if I can just connect to what Andrew actually said about the possible private, in inverted commas, market that we do, that we can possibly observe to a certain extent, is that, yeah, based on my own work, I actually also observed some imperfect faience necklace and collar pendants, for instance, that had little dents, but they were perfectly glazed over. So somebody then finished these pieces off and actually added the loop beads to them so that they would actually be able to be used in collars. But they can't have been of the highest quality. So maybe actually then produced for private individuals, maybe to be to be made available to lower status households. Just wanted to pick up on that.
Simply to say that, of course, what was happening at Amana, this is the royal residence, and probably just 50 km away, people would never have seen a piece of glass in their lives.
There's no other comment now here from within our round. We could have a look in the chat and whether there are questions from the audience, or maybe I can encourage you to ask a question if there are questions from the audience. So we would have about 5 minutes to discuss that. So obviously, no one really does. So I would have a final kind of comment, probably what we mentioned in between, the magic of making. And when you're producing a color, the way of getting there, to see this act of producing the color as something very significant. There is a recent article by Julia Budka on the so-called blue painted pottery of the New Kingdom, where she thinks that this transformation of this pottery, where you have this kind of slurry, which is obviously not blue before, but it turns blue in firing, where she interprets this together with the motifs on this blue painted pottery as something really interconnected, and that this moment of the creation was seen as something very significant. And I think I would like to just discuss this. What do you think about this kind of the act of the creation of color? Or maybe is there in Mesopotamian sources even a text that talks about the creation of color as being something that has an importance beyond the technological process? David or Shianti?
mind is that the glass recipes, which are again a very kind of specific genre of text with their own, that have their own epistemic sort of system behind it. But what happens there is that there is a ritual described as taking place at the beginning of the glassmaking season, and glassmaking is kind of envisioned as a form of birth. It's there's a metaphor that is being used, and this metaphor then would be part of this material imaginary that I talked about before, right? This kind of, it's not about that they thought that literally that it was the kind of birth, right? An imaginary is intangible as well. It is it can contain both tangible things, as you said, Thilo, but also intangible things, ideas, shared values. And one of these shared ideas among the craftsmen was that the creation of glass was very dangerous, just like a birth, and that it required very specific ritual, a very specific ritual environment where there were pure things and impure things. There were rules about what could enter into this environment and what not. And how they also had ideas about how to mitigate the dangers of glassmaking involved in these high heat technologies, because it involved different types of kilns, involved different processes, perhaps in the same time. We don't have the archaeological evidence in Mesopotamia. So that would be an example of what you're trying to get at, where there is there are hints of this imaginary behind how they produced this colored substance.
Very important is if you look at the very few autobiographies where the people who were responsible for craftsmen describe what they're doing, they always try to avoid talking about the actual subject matter. And they usually go into this mumbo jumbo, and you wonder secrets and all sorts of things that they mastered. And so they weren't interested in telling us actually what they were doing. What they were doing was trying to make what they were doing very important.
Rituals, the opening of the mouth rituals, and all of those rituals in Egypt as well, like in Mesopotamia, where they discuss the.
I was only talking about the text where the people who were responsible for the craftsmen were describing what they were doing, not about the actual rituals. I mean, that the rituals are nonsense, I think I've said several times, but this matter of trying to make nonsense out of what is really craftsmanship is very important.
From the audience, from Iman Khalifa to Professor Mignacci. She is asking, she would like to know more about the work of the student of Professor Mignacci about pottery and stone vessels that you were mentioning before. But
couple of months, so it will be published, and this is a discussion about the integration, the influence that stone vessel makers had on pottery vessel makers and vice versa. So it's sort of a contamination lab. We don't need to think as two separate things, but the article will be published soon in a journal, so I can tell more about this.
Okay, thank you.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It will be open access, not exactly open access, but it will be on JSTOR.
So there's actually a reply by Iman that there's an article published in the Prähistorische Zeitschrift 2023, which argues that pottery vessels were made earlier than stone vessels, different from what was earlier believed by scholars. Okay, no real.
Japan or China, you can have Siberia, very early pottery, and probably not so many stone vessels.
Yeah. If you are going here in Cyprus in the museum in the pre-pottery Neolithic, you see a lot of stone vessels actually in the 8th and 9th millennium BC. Yeah. John. Gianluca, you have another comment?
Well, just like to comment on the last question of David, just to see that sometimes we focused in the past on the consumers. I think what we are trying to see differently is the mind of the craftsman. That's replying to Shandy, something that definitely we can't enter in the mind, but we are trying after a project at University of Pisa with Vanessa Forte. She's prehistorian now in La Sapienza in Roma. We are trying to work with neuropsychologists and see how people learning how to make clay, making figurines of clay, working with clay, how this changed the brain of the producer. So it's something that I think has been slightly unexplored. And probably this article was provocative in order to see that we should also change the direction rather than see the consumers. We should see also the producers.
Yeah, no, what I think we have to understand that the consumers were the ones who were decisive for what is preserved in the archaeological record.
I think this is a wonderful word of closing this morning session, this roundtable discussion that we had here this morning in Nicosia. So I would like to thank all the participants here in the audience, as well as all the participants online for their presence. And I hope it has somehow given you some more ideas, and it was a lot of food for thought, I think. And this is at least what we wanted to do with this morning. Thank you very much.